On a rain-soaked
Oh,
Thursday
wow,
evening
that
in
looks
Austin,
amazing.
Texas,
I know, I can't wait to
23-year-old
try it.
Zarchin walked into the most expensive restaurant in the city with exactly $12 in her wallet and a heart full of desperation. She had no idea that the man she was about to humiliate, the one she assumed was just another waiter, would turn out to be worth more than most small countries. What happened next didn't just change her life. It exposed a truth about human nature that will make you question everything you think you know about first impressions. But here's what makes this story different from every other rags-to-riches tale you've heard. This isn't about luck or charity or some wealthy person's guilt. This is about a test that most people fail without even knowing they're taking it. A test that reveals who you really are when you think nobody important is watching. A test that Zarchin was about to take, completely by accident, in front of a man who'd been administering it for 20 years. See, the man Zar mistook for a waiter had developed a very specific way of judging people's character. He'd learned, through painful experience, that people's true nature only emerges when they believe there's nothing to be gained from being kind. When they think the person they're talking to can't help them climb the ladder, make connections, or advance their career. When they think that person is, quite literally, just there to serve them. For 20 years, Alexander Kane had been testing people this way. Billionaires, politicians, business partners. He'd watched them all interact with people they thought were beneath them. And for 20 years, he'd been disappointed by what he saw. Until the night Zarchin walked up to his table and made the most expensive mistake of her life. But before we get to that moment that would alter the course of two lives forever, you need to understand how a brilliant college graduate ended up so desperate that she'd risk everything on one final, reckless gamble. Because the story of that night doesn't begin in that restaurant. It begins 3 months earlier in a gleaming office building in downtown Austin, where Zarchin thought she had everything figured out. 3 months before that fateful night, Zarchin was living what most people would call the American dream. Fresh out of the University of Texas with a degree in computer science and a 3.8 GPA, she'd landed a coveted position at a promising tech startup in Austin's booming downtown district. The company was called Novatech Solutions, and on paper, it looked like the next big thing. The interviews had been rigorous. 3 rounds of technical assessments, behavioral interviews, and a final presentation to the executive team. Zara had impressed them all with her innovative approach to machine learning algorithms and her ability to explain complex technical concepts in simple terms. When they offered her a starting salary of $85,000 a year, more money than her immigrant parents had ever dreamed of making, she felt like she'd finally made it. Her parents, Lee and Wei Chun, had come to America from Taiwan with nothing but determination and a belief that education could transform their daughter's life. Her father worked 16-hour days at a convenience store, while her mother cleaned office buildings at night. They'd sacrificed everything to put Zara through college, often going without new clothes or medical care to pay for her textbooks and lab fees. When Zara got the job at Novatech, her mother cried for the first time in years. Happy tears, finally. Zara signed a lease on a downtown loft for $2,400 a month, a sum that would have horrified her parents if they'd known, but seemed reasonable for someone making her salary. She bought her first car, a certified pre-owned Honda Civic that she'd been eyeing since her sophomore year. She opened her first investment account and started putting away money for a house down payment. For the first time in her life, she felt like she belonged in the world she'd studied so hard to enter. Novatech specialized in predictive analytics for supply chain management. It was exactly the kind of unsexy but profitable niche that smart money loved to back. The company had raised $12 million in series of funding just 6 months before Zara joined, and the CEO, Marcus Holloway, was already talking about a Series B round that would value the company at over $100 million. Marcus was everything a tech CEO was supposed to be: charismatic, visionary, completely convinced of his own genius. He dropped out of Stanford to start his first company, which he'd sold for $30 million at age 25. He drove a Tesla Model S, wore the same style of black t-shirt every day, and spoke in a kind of inspirational platitudes that made employees feel like they were changing the world rather than just optimizing inventory systems. The office was everything Zara had imagined a tech startup would be. Open floor plans, standing desks, a kitchen stocked with organic snacks and craft beer. There was a meditation room, a game room with vintage arcade machines, and a rooftop terrace where employees gathered for Friday afternoon happy hours. The work was challenging and meaningful, and Zara felt like she was finally using her education for something that mattered. What Zara didn't know was that Marcus Holloway had been cooking the books for months. The company was hemorrhaging money, burning through investor cash faster than a wildfire through dry Texas brush. The predictive analytics software they promised to deliver was months behind schedule and riddled with bugs that the engineering team couldn't solve. Major clients were canceling contracts, demanding refunds, and threatening lawsuits. The Series B funding round that Marcus kept promising was a fantasy. No venture capital firm would touch Novatech once they looked at the real numbers. But Marcus was a master at maintaining appearances. He continued to lease expensive office space, hire new employees, and talk publicly about the company's bright future. He authorized company retreats to expensive resorts, invested in premium coffee machines for the office kitchen, and gave everyone the impression that Novatech was just months away from becoming Austin's next unicorn startup. The first sign of trouble came in late June, when payroll was delayed by 3 days. Marcus explained it as a banking issue. Their rapid growth had triggered some automated fraud detection systems, and it would take a few days to resolve. Everyone accepted this explanation because Marcus had always been transparent with the team. And besides, startups were notorious for having cash flow issues in their early days. The second sign came 2 weeks later, when the company's health insurance was temporarily suspended. Again, Marcus had a plausible explanation. They were switching to a better provider, and there would be a brief gap in coverage while the transition was completed. He assured everyone that any medical expenses incurred during the gap would be reimbursed by the company. By mid-July, the signs were becoming harder to ignore. The premium coffee was replaced with generic brand. The office cleaning service was reduced from daily to twice weekly. The Friday afternoon happy hours were quietly discontinued. When employees asked about these changes, Marcus talked about optimizing operational efficiency and focusing resources on core product development. What Marcus couldn't hide was the fact that major clients were publicly distancing themselves from Novatech. Retail Corp, their biggest customer, issued a press release announcing they were terminating their contract due to failure to deliver promised functionality. 2 other major clients followed within the same week. The local tech press started asking questions about Novatech's financial stability. On a Tuesday morning in July, Zara arrived at the office to find the doors chained shut. A notice from the bankruptcy court was taped to glass, informing employees that Novatech Solutions had filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy and that all operations had ceased immediately. Personal items could be retrieved between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. with proper identification and supervision from a bankruptcy trustee. Standing in the parking lot with 37 other shocked employees, Zara felt her carefully constructed future crumble in real time. The salary she'd counted on, the stock options that were supposed to make her wealthy, the stable career path she'd mapped out, all of it disappeared in an instant. She had enough money in her checking account to cover her rent for maybe 2 months, and that was only if she stopped eating and canceled every subscription and service she'd signed up for. But the financial catastrophe was only the beginning of her problems. What Zara couldn't have known was that Marcus Holloway had become something of a cautionary tale in the tech world. The bankruptcy filing revealed that he'd been systematically misleading investors, employees, and clients about the company's capabilities and financial position. Federal prosecutors were considering fraud charges. Any company that Googled Zara's employment history would see Novatech's spectacular collapse and Marcus's emerging legal troubles. In an industry built on trust and reputation, being associated with a scandal, even as a victim, was like wearing a scarlet letter. Hiring managers would wonder what Zara had known, and when she'd known it, they'd question her judgment for joining the company in the first place. They'd worry that associating with her might somehow taint their own reputations. Have you ever trusted someone completely, only to have them destroy your life without a second thought? Keep watching, because what happened to Zara will make you rethink every decision you've ever made about who to trust. And here's the thing that makes this story even more devastating. Zara's fall from grace was just beginning. The real test of her character wouldn't come from losing everything she'd worked for. It would come from how she treated people when she thought she had nothing left to lose. The cruel mathematics of financial ruin are relentless. Rent doesn't pause for unemployment. Car payments don't care about broken dreams. Student loan servicers don't offer sympathy for victims of corporate fraud. And in a city like Austin, where the cost of living had skyrocketed beyond what most people could afford, Zara had exactly 67 days before she'd lose everything. She applied to every tech company in Texas. Google had an Austin office. Apple was building a massive campus. Meta was hiring engineers by the hundreds. Amazon had multiple facilities throughout the state. On paper, Zara was exactly what these companies were looking for: young, talented, educated, with real-world experience in exactly the kind of predictive analytics that tech giants needed. But the rejection emails came one after another, each one more devastating than the last. We've decided to move forward with other candidates. Your background doesn't align with our current needs. We'll keep your resume on file for future opportunities. The form letters were polite, but final. The companies that bothered to provide feedback mentioned concerns about stability and questions about your previous employer's practices. Zara started expanding her search beyond tech companies. She applied to consulting firms, financial services companies, even government agencies. She lowered her salary expectations from $85,000 to $70,000, then to $60,000, then to whatever they were willing to pay. She applied for positions that were clearly beneath her qualifications: junior developer roles, internships, even customer service positions that required technical knowledge. The unemployment office in Austin was a study in bureaucratic indifference. The caseworkers were overworked and underpaid, processing hundreds of claims from people whose lives had been upended by corporate downsizing, automation, and economic uncertainty. Zara's case was straightforward. She'd been laid off through no fault of her own when her employer went bankrupt, but the weekly benefit amount of $521 barely covered her groceries, much less her rent and car payment. She tried to negotiate with her landlord, explaining her situation and asking for a temporary reduction in rent. The property management company was unsympathetic. Austin's rental market was so hot that they could release her apartment within a week, probably for $200 more than she was currently paying. They offered her a choice: pay in full or move out. There was no middle ground. The car dealership was slightly more flexible. They offered to defer her payments for 3 months, but the interest would continue to accrue, and she'd have to pay a $50 deferment fee for each month. It was a bad deal that would cost her hundreds of dollars in the long run, but it was better than having her car repossessed. By October, Zara had moved out her downtown loft and into a shared apartment in East Austin, the kind of place where the air conditioning barely worked in the brutal Texas heat, and the neighbors played music until 3 a.m. Her roommate, Kelsey, was a part-time yoga instructor and full-time social media influencer who spent most of her day taking photos of herself in different outfits and locations around the city. Kelsey was the kind of person who'd never worried about money because she'd never had to. Her parents own a chain of upscale salons in Dallas and had been supporting her Austin lifestyle for 3 years while she found herself. She treated money like it was infinite, ordering expensive meals from delivery apps and buying new clothes whenever she felt sad or bored. The shared apartment was a step down from anything Zara had imagined for herself. Her bedroom was barely large enough for a twin bed and a dresser. The kitchen appliances were ancient and unreliable. The bathroom had a persistent mold problem that the landlord refused to address. The neighborhood was transitioning from working-class Latino families to young professionals, which meant gentrification was driving up prices while the infrastructure remained inadequate. Zara had sold her car, her laptop, even her college textbooks to cover moving expenses and her portion of the security deposit. She bought a used bicycle from a pawn shop and learned Austin's bus routes by heart. Every morning, she'd check job listings on her phone, apply to anything remotely relevant, and then spend the day walking around downtown, dropping off resumes at companies that might not have posted openings yet. The psychological toll of extended unemployment was worse than the financial strain. Each rejection chipped away at her confidence and self-worth. She started wondering if she'd chosen the wrong major, if her education was worthless, if she'd fundamentally misunderstood something about how the professional world worked. The dream she'd had of buying a house, starting a family, making her parents proud, all of it seemed absurdly naive now. She took a job at a coffee shop on South Congress, making $12 an hour plus tips. The work was physically demanding and mentally numbing. She'd wake up at 5 a.m. to open the shop, spend 8 hours on her feet making lattes for tourists and local hipsters, and come home exhausted with her hands stained brown from coffee grounds and her back aching from leaning over the espresso machine. Her co-workers were mostly college students and aspiring musicians who saw the job as temporary. They could afford to treat it casually because they had other options: family money, student loans, or simply the confidence that comes with youth. For Zara, every shift represented a gap between survival and homelessness. She couldn't afford to be casual about anything. The customers ranged from kind to indifferent to openly hostile. The tech workers who came in for their morning caffeine fixes would sometimes recognize her from industry meetups or LinkedIn. Their awkward attempt at small talk, "Hey, didn't you work at that company that went under?" were more painful than outright rudeness. The tourists were generally pleasant but completely unaware that the cheerful young woman making their drinks had a computer science degree and spoke 3 languages. The worst were the wealthy locals who treated service workers like furniture. They'd talk on their phones while ordering, leave messes for someone else to clean up, and act annoyed when asked to repeat their order. Zara learned to smile through their condescension, to say "have a great day" to people who just treated her like she was invisible. The tips were unpredictable and often insulting. A complicated drink order that took 5 minutes to prepare might earn a 50-cent tip. A simple coffee that took 30 seconds might earn $5 from someone who was feeling generous. There was no correlation between effort and reward, no way to control her income through skill or dedication. By December, Zara was working 45 hours a week at the coffee shop and still barely making ends meet. After taxes, her paycheck was around $1,800 per month. Her share of rent was $800. Utilities were another $150. Groceries cost at least $300, and her bus pass was $40. That left her with $510 for everything else: phone bill, clothes, any unexpected expenses, and the student loan payment that she'd already deferred twice. She applied for food stamps, but earned just enough to disqualify herself. She looked into government assistance programs, but found that most were designed for people with children or those who were completely unemployed. Being underemployed, working full-time for poverty wages, fell into a bureaucratic gray area where little help was available. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening, when Kelsey casually mentioned that she was behind on rent and expected Zara to cover her portion. $800. Money that Zara simply didn't have. Money that represented 3 weeks of full-time work at the coffee shop after taxes. "It's just temporary," Kelsey said, not looking up from her phone where she was editing photos from her latest sponsored post. "My parents are being weird about money right now, but they'll come around. You can spot me this month, right?" Zara stared at her roommate, this person who'd never worked a real job, never worried about rent, never had to choose between groceries and utilities, and felt something break inside her chest. Not anger, exactly, but a kind of desperate clarity about how alone she really was. Imagine working yourself to the bone and still being unable to make ends meet. If you've ever been there, you know exactly what Zara was feeling. And if you haven't, consider yourself lucky, because what she did next was something most people would never consider. That night, after Kelsey had gone out to some gallery opening downtown, Zara sat on her twin bed and calculated her options. She could move out, but she'd need first month's rent, last month's rent, and a security deposit for any new place, at least $2,500 that she didn't have. She could ask her parents for help, but they were already struggling to support themselves and had sacrificed so much for her education. She could try to find a second job, but she was already working as many hours as the coffee shop would give her, and most employers wanted availability that conflicted with her existing schedule. That's when Kelsey's suggestion from weeks earlier started to seem less ridiculous. She'd heard about a restaurant downtown where wealthy businessmen went to make deals. The kind of place where a single tip could be more than most people made in a week. "You're smart and pretty," Kelsey had said. "Rich men love feeling like heroes." Just find someone successful but approachable and see if they'll help you out. The plan was humiliating, desperate, and completely out of character for someone who'd always prided herself on self-reliance. But as Zara looked around her tiny bedroom, at the second-hand furniture, the clothes she'd worn to work for the third time this week, the empty refrigerator in the next room, she realized that pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. Little did she know, walking into that restaurant would put her face-to-face with someone who'd been watching stories like hers unfold for years, and who developed his own unique way of dealing with people's assumptions about wealth and power. The man she was about to meet had been testing human character for 2 decades, and he'd learned that desperation reveals people's true nature in ways that prosperity never can. But first, you need to understand who Alexander Kane really was, and why a billionaire would choose to dress like a construction worker and drive a 15-year-old pickup truck. Because the philosophy behind his unusual lifestyle would determine whether Zara Chen's desperate gamble would save her life or destroy what little dignity she had left. The decision to walk into Meridian Restaurant wasn't made in a moment of clarity or confidence. It was made at 2 a.m. on a Thursday morning, when Zara Chen sat on her bathroom floor crying because she'd just discovered that her last $47 had been eaten up by an overdraft fee she hadn't expected. Her checking account was negative $23, her credit cards were maxed out, and her roommate Kelsey was snoring peacefully in the next room, completely unaware that her casual request for rent money had pushed Zara over the edge. Zara had never been the kind of person who asked strangers for help. Growing up, she'd watched her parents work themselves to exhaustion rather than accept charity from their church or government assistance programs. "We came to America to build something," her father used to say, "not to take what others built." That pride had been passed down to Zara like a genetic trait, making the idea of approaching wealthy strangers for money feel like a betrayal of everything she'd been raised to believe. But pride doesn't pay rent. Pride doesn't put food on the table. Pride doesn't protect you from eviction notices and repo men and the slow, grinding humiliation of watching your life fall apart one bill at a time. The research phase of her desperate plan had taken weeks. Zara spent her lunch breaks at the coffee shop scrolling through Austin Business Journal articles, identifying the restaurants where tech executives and venture capitalists were most likely to be found. She studied Yelp reviews and open-table reservations, looking for places that were expensive enough to attract serious money, but not so exclusive that she'd be turned away at the door. Meridian kept coming up in her searches. Located in the heart of downtown Austin, it was a kind of restaurant where CEOs took potential investors, where deals worth millions were negotiated over $200 bottles of wine and dry-aged steaks that cost more than Zara made in a week. The restaurant had been featured in Texas Monthly as one of the state's most influential dining establishments, not just for its food, but for the power dynamics that played out among its clientele. The plan, such as it was, had been shaped by conversations with Kelsey and her wealthy friend from Dallas. According to them, rich men in Austin fell into predictable categories. The old money crowd was polite but distant, unlikely to engage with strangers. The new money tech entrepreneurs were more approachable but also more suspicious, having been burned by people seeking handouts before. The best targets, they agreed, were successful professionals in their 40s and 50s, old enough to have substantial wealth but young enough to remember what it felt like to struggle. Look for someone eating alone, Kelsey had advised. Someone who seemed successful but not flashy. Guys who are really secure in their wealth don't need to show it off. And whatever you do, don't lead with your sob story. Nobody wants to hear about your problems. Start with small talk, see if there's chemistry, and then gradually work up to asking for help. The advice made Zara feel sick to her stomach, but she couldn't deny its practical logic. She'd spent months applying for jobs through proper channels, following all the rules, doing everything the way it was supposed to be done. The result had been continuous rejection and steadily increasing desperation. Maybe it was time to try a different approach. She practiced her pitch in the mirror of the coffee shop bathroom during her breaks. "Hi, I hope you don't mind me bothering you, but I couldn't help noticing." She tried different opening lines, different explanations for why she was alone in an expensive restaurant, different ways of transitioning from casual conversation to a request for help. The hardest part was figuring out what story to tell. The truth, that she was a college-educated professional who'd been unemployed for months and was now working at a coffee shop for survival wages, seemed too complicated and potentially off-putting. Rich people, she'd learned, preferred simpler narratives. They wanted to help deserving victims of clear-cut tragedies, not navigate the complex realities of economic inequality and employment discrimination. She settled on a version of the truth that emphasized her education and work ethic, while downplaying the desperation. She presented herself as a talented professional going through temporary difficulties due to circumstances beyond her control. She'd hint at her financial struggles without going into detail about overdraft fees and maxed-out credit cards. She'd position any request for help as an investment in someone with obvious potential rather than charity for someone who was failing. The clothes were another challenge. Everything in her wardrobe fell into two categories: professional attire that was too nice for the coffee shop and casual clothes that were too shabby for an upscale restaurant. She borrowed a black dress from Kelsey. Simple, elegant, and expensive enough to blend in among Meridian's clientele. The shoes were her own, pumps she'd bought for job interviews months earlier and hadn't worn since. The morning of her planned restaurant visit, Zara called in sick to work. This was entirely a lie. The stress of what she was about to attempt had given her a genuine headache and churning stomach, but it meant losing $96 in wages she desperately needed. She spent the day alternating between anxious preparation and paralyzed doubt, changing her mind about the plan every few hours. By 6 p.m., she'd almost talked herself out of it entirely. The whole scheme seemed absurd and demeaning. She was a computer scientist, not a con artist. She had skills and education and potential. Surely there was a better way to solve her financial problems than approaching strangers in restaurants. But when she opened her laptop to look for job listings one more time, the first thing she saw was an email from her student loan servicer. Her next payment was due in 10 days, and she'd already exhausted her deferment options. Missed this payment, and her account would go into default, destroying her credit rating and potentially making her ineligible for any future educational benefits or government programs. The second email was from her landlord, reminding all tenants that rent was due on the first of the month and that late fees would be assessed after a 3-day grace period. The third was from her car insurance company, threatening to cancel her policy if she didn't bring her account current within 2 weeks. Each email was a reminder that her problems weren't going away. They were getting worse every day, compounding like interest on a debt she couldn't repay. Every day she waited, every day she hoped for a miracle job offer or a sudden windfall, was another day closer to complete financial collapse. At 7:30 p.m., Zara Chin stood outside Meridian Restaurant, staring at her reflection in the rain-streaked windows. Inside, she could see exactly the scene she'd imagined. Well-dressed professionals dining on meals that cost more than she made in a week, discussing deals and investments and opportunities that existed in a world she'd briefly inhabited but no longer had access to. The plan was simple in theory. Find someone wealthy but approachable, strike up a conversation, and see if they'd be willing to help her out of her financial hole. In practice, every aspect of it felt impossible. How do you identify someone's net worth by looking at them? How do you approach a stranger without seeming desperate or predatory? How do you ask for money without destroying your own dignity in the process? The rain was coming down harder now, soaking through her borrowed dress and ruining the careful styling she'd spent an hour perfecting. She had $12.37 in her wallet, enough to order an appetizer and a soft drink if she was careful about taxes and tip. She had one shot at this, one evening, to either solve her financial crisis or confirm that she was destined for homelessness and complete failure. Standing there in the rain, Zara thought about her parents and the sacrifices they'd made to give her opportunities they'd never had. She thought about her professors at UT who'd encouraged her to pursue her dreams and assured her that talent and hard work would be rewarded. She thought about the version of herself who'd walked across that graduation stage 8 months earlier, full of confidence and optimism about the future. That version of herself would have been horrified by what she was about to do. That Zara Chun would never have considered approaching strangers for money, would have found the entire plan beneath her dignity and self-respect. But that Zara Chun had never spent months watching her life disintegrate one rejection letter at a time. She'd never had to choose between groceries and utilities, never had to smile through condescension from customers who treated her like she was invisible, never had to face the possibility of calling her parents to admit that all their sacrifices had been wasted. The hostess who greeted her at Meridian's entrance was polished and professional, the kind of young woman who'd probably been hired as much for her appearance as her customer service skills. She looked at Zara's dress, expensive but slightly damp from the rain, and made some quick calculation about whether this potential customer was worth her full attention. "Good evening," she said with practiced warmth. "Do you have a reservation?" Zara had anticipated this question and prepared her answer. "I'm actually hoping you might have space at the bar. I'm meeting someone who might be running late, and I thought I'd wait here rather than at home." The lie came more easily than she'd expected, which somehow made her feel even worse about the entire situation. 3 months ago, she'd been the kind of person who returned extra change to cashiers and called to correct billing errors in her favor. Now she was lying to restaurant hostesses and planning to manipulate strangers for money. The transformation was complete, even if she didn't fully recognize it yet. The hostess glanced toward the bar area, where several well-dressed men sat alone with their phones and drinks. "Of course, right this way." As they walked through the dining room, Zara tried to evaluate the potential targets. There was a man in his 60s wearing a suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent, but he looked stern and unapproachable. Another wore the kind of casual but expensive clothing favored by tech executives, but he was clearly on a business call that might last hours. A third was younger, maybe early 30s, wearing designer jeans and a button-down shirt, but something about his demeanor suggested he was the kind of person who'd made his money quickly and had little patience for sob stories. And then she saw him, sitting alone at a corner table, wearing a faded flannel shirt and reading something on a phone. He looked completely out of place among Meridian's usual clientele, more like a construction worker who'd wandered into the wrong restaurant than a successful businessman closing deals over expensive wine. To Zara, exhausted and desperate and running out of options, he looked like exactly what Kelsey had described. Successful but approachable, wealthy enough to be dining alone at Meridian, but secure enough in that wealth to dress casually. He looked like someone who might remember what it felt like to struggle, someone who might be willing to help a young woman get back on her feet. What Zara couldn't have known was that the man in the flannel shirt was conducting a test that he'd been perfecting for 20 years. A test designed to reveal people's true character when they thought no one important was watching. A test that she was about to take, completely by accident, with consequences that would determine not just her own future, but everything she thought she knew about wealth, power, and human dignity. But before we reveal what happened when Zara approached that table, you need to understand exactly who Alexander Kane was and why a billionaire would choose to look like someone who couldn't afford to eat at his own restaurant. Because the philosophy behind his deception would determine whether Zara's desperate gamble would destroy her life or save it in ways she couldn't possibly imagine. To understand what happened that night at Meridian, you need to meet the man who would change Zara's life forever. His name was Alexander Kane, and at 42 years old, he'd built an empire that most people couldn't even comprehend. His investment firm, Kane Capital, managed over $2 billion in assets across 3 continents. His personal portfolio included stakes in everything from artificial intelligence startups to renewable energy projects to real estate developments that reshaped entire neighborhoods. The numbers surrounding Alexander's wealth were almost abstract in their magnitude. His Manhattan penthouse was worth $47 million. His London property overlooked Hyde Park and had been featured in Architectural Digest. His Tokyo offices occupied 3 floors of one of the city's most prestigious business towers. He owned a vineyard in Napa Valley, a ranch in Montana, and a private island in the Caribbean that he'd bought on a whim and visited exactly twice. Forbes estimated his personal net worth at somewhere north of $300 million, though Alexander's wealth was structured through so many holding companies and investment vehicles that even he wasn't entirely sure of the exact figure. What he did know was that he could afford anything he wanted, go anywhere he chose, and buy his way out of virtually any problem that money could solve. But here's what made Alexander different from every other billionaire in America. He refused to look the part. While other wealthy men his age wore $1,000 suits and drove cars that cost more than most people's houses, Alexander had developed a completely different relationship with the visual markers of success. His daily uniform consisted of flannel shirts from LL Bean, jeans from Levi's, and work boots that he'd owned for over a decade. His primary vehicle was a 15-year-old Toyota pickup truck with over 200,000 miles on the odometer and a dent in the passenger door from a parking lot encounter 3 years earlier. He carried his phone in a case that was held together with electrical tape and wore a digital watch that he'd bought at a gas station convenience store. The contrast between Alexander's actual wealth and his chosen appearance wasn't accidental. It was a result of a carefully developed philosophy about human nature, social dynamics, and the corrupting influence of obvious wealth. A philosophy that had been shaped by one of the most painful experiences of his life. 23 years earlier, Alexander had been a different person entirely. Fresh out of Harvard Business School with an MBA and burning ambition, he'd started an environmental consulting firm with 2 classmates and a business plan that promised to revolutionize how corporations approach sustainability. The company was called EcoStrat Solutions, and for its first 2 years, it seemed destined for extraordinary success. Alexander's role was business development and client relations, and he was exceptionally good at it. He had a natural ability to understand what potential clients wanted to hear and present complex environmental solutions in terms that made sense to executives who cared more about profit margins than carbon footprints. By the end of their second year, EcoStrat had contracts with 12 Fortune 500 companies and revenue approaching $3 million annually. Success had allowed Alexander to adopt a lifestyle he thought he'd always wanted. He bought a BMW, moved into a luxury apartment in Boston's Back Bay, and started shopping at the kind of stores where salespeople worked on commission and remembered their best customers by name. He joined an exclusive gym, ate at restaurants where reservations required 2 weeks' notice, and wore suits that cost more than his parents had spent on clothes in an entire year. More importantly, success had brought him Vanessa Rothwell. She was everything a young entrepreneur thought he wanted in a partner. Beautiful, sophisticated, connected to Boston's old money society through family ties that went back to the Mayflower. Her father owned a chain of luxury hotels. Her mother served on the boards of several prominent charities. And her social circle included politicians, business leaders, and celebrities who treated wealth like oxygen, essential but unremarkable. Vanessa was studying art history at Harvard when they met, though studying was perhaps too strong a word for someone whose primary academic challenge was avoiding classes that conflicted with her social obligations. She had never worked a job, never worried about money, and never had to consider the practical implications of her choices. Her life was a series of gallery openings, charity galas, and weekend trips to family properties in the Hamptons or Martha's Vineyard. Alexander was captivated by her world. The effortless elegance, the casual references to famous artists and powerful politicians, the assumption that beautiful experiences were simply part of life rather than luxuries to be earned. When she agreed to marry him after 18 months of dating, he felt like he'd finally gained admission to a club he'd been trying to join his entire life. The engagement party was held at her family's estate in Newport, Rhode Island. 300 guests, catered by the same company that handled events at the White House, featuring musicians who commanded 6-figure performance fees. Alexander's parents flew in from their modest home in Ohio, visibly overwhelmed by the scale and sophistication of the celebration. His mother wore a dress she bought specifically for the occasion at JCPenney, while the other guests wore gowns that cost more than his parents' monthly mortgage payment. But the fairy tale came crashing down in March of their second year in business. EcoStrat's largest client, a chemical company facing EPA sanctions, abruptly terminated their contract after new management decided that paying for environmental consulting was less cost-effective than simply fighting regulatory actions in court. 2 other major clients followed within the same month, citing budget constraints and changing priorities. Without warning, EcoStrat's monthly revenue dropped from $400,000 to less than $150,000. The company's fixed costs, office rent, employee salaries, insurance, and equipment leases, remained unchanged. Alexander and his partners had been so confident in their growth trajectory that they never built adequate cash reserves. Within 6 weeks, they were facing bankruptcy. Alexander threw himself into trying to save the company. He worked 18-hour days cold calling potential clients, restructuring existing contracts, and negotiating with creditors. He liquidated his personal investments, sold his BMW, and moved to a cheaper apartment to reduce expenses. He stopped going to expensive restaurants, canceled his gym membership, and started buying clothes from discount retailers. Vanessa's reaction to his changed circumstances was immediate and devastating. She stopped returning his phone calls. When he finally reached her, she explained that she was taking some space to think about things. The engagement ring, a 3-carat diamond that cost him $47,000, was returned via messenger service with a note that said simply, "I think this belongs to you now." 3 weeks later, he learned through mutual friends that she was dating Jonathan Blackstone, heir to a hedge fund fortune, and exactly the kind of man her parents had always hoped she'd marry. The engagement was announced in the New York Times 6 months later. The wedding, held at the same Newport estate where Alexander had once felt so welcomed, was covered in Vanity Fair. The note Vanessa left him was brutal in its honesty. "I fell in love with your potential, not you. I fell in love with the life I thought we'd build together, not the person you actually are. When you have something to offer again, call me. Until then, I need to protect my own future." EcoStrat Solutions filed for bankruptcy protection in September. Alexander's business partners, both from wealthy families, were able to move back in with their parents and eventually found positions at their father's companies. Alexander, whose parents were a retired school teacher and a factory supervisor, had no such safety net. He spent the next 3 years rebuilding his life from absolutely nothing. He took a job as a financial analyst at a mid-sized investment firm, working for a fraction of his previous income, while slowly paying off the debts that bankruptcy hadn't discharged. He lived in a studio apartment in a neighborhood where gunshots were background noise and learned to shop at discount grocery stores. But those 3 years of genuine poverty taught Alexander something invaluable about human nature. He learned to distinguish between people who were kind because kindness was their default mode and people who were kind because they thought kindness might benefit them somehow. He learned that most people's respect, affection, and attention were conditional on what they believed you could do for them. More importantly, he learned that the most accurate way to judge someone's character was to observe how they treated people they thought couldn't help them advance their own interests, how they spoke to waiters and janitors and customer service representatives, how they behaved when they thought no one important was watching. The lesson was reinforced repeatedly as Alexander slowly rebuilt his wealth. Each step up the economic ladder revealed new layers of social dynamics and power relationships. People who had ignored him when he was struggling suddenly became interested when he started earning decent money. Women who wouldn't have given him a second look when he was driving a used Honda began finding reasons to spend time with him when he could afford to take them to nice restaurants. By age 35, Alexander had accumulated enough capital to start his own investment firm. Kane Capital's first fund was modest, $50 million raised primarily from high-net-worth individuals who appreciated Alexander's analytical approach and track record of identifying undervalued opportunities. But his investment philosophy, shaped by his own experience with failure and recovery, proved remarkably successful. Alexander specialized in finding companies that were fundamentally sound but temporarily distressed due to market conditions, management changes, or industry disruption. He understood better than most investors that temporary setbacks often created extraordinary long-term opportunities for those patient enough to wait for recovery and smart enough to identify which companies would emerge stronger. Kane Capital's first fund generated returns of 23% annually over 5 years. The second fund, capitalized at $200 million, did even better. By the time Alexander turned 40, he was managing over $1.5 billion and had earned a reputation as one of the most successful value investors of his generation. But wealth, when it finally came, hadn't brought Alexander the satisfaction he'd expected. The material possessions that had once seemed so important, the luxury cars, the expensive watches, the designer clothing, felt hollow and performative. He'd bought them because successful people were supposed to want them, not because they actually improved his life in any meaningful way. More troubling was the way people's behavior toward him changed as his net worth increased. Old acquaintances who'd ignored him during his years of struggle suddenly wanted to reconnect. Business associates who treated him as an equal when Kane Capital was small became deferential and obsequious as his reputation grew. Women who'd shown no interest in him when he was a mid-level analyst began finding excuses to attend the same charity events and industry conferences. The parallels to his relationship with Vanessa were impossible to ignore. People weren't interested in Alexander Kane the person. They were interested in Alexander Kane the billionaire. They wanted access to his wealth, his connections, his ability to solve their problems or advance their careers. Strip away the money and the status, and most of them would lose interest immediately. This realization led Alexander to an experiment that would define the next phase of his life. What if he could separate his wealth from his appearance? What if he could interact with people who had no idea what he was worth? What if he could observe their true character without the distorting influence of obvious money? The transformation was gradual but deliberate. Alexander stopped wearing expensive suits and started buying clothes from mainstream retailers. He sold his Mercedes and bought the Toyota pickup truck. He moved out of his Manhattan penthouse and into a comfortable but unremarkable apartment in Brooklyn. He started dining at neighborhood restaurants instead of Michelin-starred establishments. The change in how people treated him was immediate and dramatic. Service industry workers who'd once fawned over his obvious wealth became indifferent or occasionally dismissive. Business contacts who'd once competed for his attention started treating him like a middle manager rather than a decision-maker. Women who'd once found him fascinating suddenly seemed to lose interest in conversation. But Alexander also discovered something remarkable. A small percentage of people treated him exactly the same regardless of his apparent wealth. These people were genuinely kind to waiters and taxi drivers and store clerks, not because they hoped to gain something, but because treating others with dignity was simply who they were. These were the people Alexander wanted in his life. These were the people he wanted to do business with, to invest in, to trust with responsibilities and opportunities. But identifying them required careful observation and sometimes elaborate testing. Which brings us back to that rainy Thursday evening at Meridian Restaurant. Alexander Kane sat at table 17, as he had twice a week for the past 3 years, watching Austin's elite perform their wealth and judge each other by superficial markers of success. He was conducting his usual experiment in social dynamics, presenting himself as someone unremarkable and observing how people responded. He had no way of knowing that a desperate young woman was about to approach his table and make an assumption that would test both their characters in ways neither could have anticipated. He couldn't have predicted that Zara Chen's mistake would create an opportunity to discover whether genuine kindness still existed in a world where everyone seemed to want something. But Alexander Kane had been testing people's character for 20 years, and he developed very specific criteria for distinguishing between performance and authenticity. What happened next would determine not just whether Zara Chen passed his test, but whether she possessed the kind of character that deserved a second chance in a world that rarely offered them. The question that had driven Alexander's philosophy for 2 decades was simple. How do you treat people when you think they can't do anything for you? Zara Chen was about to provide an answer that would change both their lives forever. Alexander Kane's unusual approach to wealth hadn't developed overnight. It was a product of 20 years of careful observation, painful lessons, and a growing understanding of how money affected every human interaction in ways most people never recognized. His decision to hide his wealth behind working-class clothing and an old pickup truck was an eccentricity. It was a result of a systematic study of human nature that had begun during his darkest period and continued through his rise to extraordinary success. The foundation of Alexander's philosophy could be traced to a specific moment 3 years after EcoStrat's bankruptcy, when he was working as a mid-level financial analyst and living in a studio apartment that smelled perpetually of his neighbor's cooking. He'd been invited to a Harvard Business School reunion, the first social event he'd attended since losing everything, and had spent 2 weeks debating whether to go. The reunion was held at a luxury hotel in Cambridge, the kind of place where Alexander had once felt comfortable but now felt like an imposter. His classmates had spent the intervening years climbing corporate ladders, starting successful companies, or joining family businesses that provided both wealth and security. They wore expensive suits, discussed their recent purchases of vacation homes, and shared stories about exotic trips that cost more than Alexander's annual rent. What struck Alexander most powerfully wasn't their success. He was genuinely happy for classmates who'd worked hard and achieved their goals, but how differently they treated him now that his circumstances had changed. People who'd once sought out his opinions on business strategy now offered polite, but brief small talk before moving on to more promising conversations. Former study group partners who'd once valued his insights now seemed uncomfortable discussing their own achievements in his presence. The most revealing moment came during a conversation with Marcus Webb, a classmate who joined Goldman Sachs immediately after graduation and was now a managing director earning well over $1 million annually. Marcus had always been competitive and status conscious, but he'd also been genuinely friendly during their MBA program. "So what are you up to these days?" Marcus asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer wouldn't be impressive. When Alexander explained that he was working as a financial analyst, Marcus's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, not cruel or mocking, but a subtle recalibration of interest and attention. The conversation continued for perhaps 2 more minutes before Marcus spotted someone more worth his time and excused himself to network with a classmate who'd recently sold a startup for $200 million. Alexander spent the rest of the evening observing similar interactions throughout the room. His former classmates weren't intentionally cruel or malicious. They were simply responding to social hierarchies and economic realities in ways that felt natural and appropriate to them. Success attracted attention and admiration. Failure warranted sympathy, but not sustained engagement. These weren't character flaws so much as efficient resource allocation in a world where everyone was competing for limited opportunities. But the experience crystallized something important for Alexander about the conditional nature of most human relationships. The people who'd found him interesting during business school hadn't changed. Their interests, personalities, and values were essentially the same. What had changed was their perception of what he could offer them in terms of connections, opportunities, or mutual benefit. This realization led Alexander to develop what he privately called the WAITER test. The idea was simple. You could learn more about someone's character by observing how they treated service industry workers than by listening to them talk about their values or accomplishments. Someone's behavior toward people they perceived as having lower status revealed their authentic personality in ways that professional or social interactions never could. Alexander began applying this test systematically. During business meetings, he'd pay attention to how potential partners and clients interacted with receptionists, security guards, and restaurant staff. During social events, he'd watch how people treated coat check attendants, bartenders, and cleaning crews. The patterns were remarkably consistent. People who were genuinely kind and respectful to everyone were also more trustworthy in business relationships, while those who showed contempt for service workers often revealed similar character flaws in professional contexts. As Alexander's wealth began to grow through his work at Kane Capital, he noticed that his own experience with the WAITER test became more complex. When he dressed expensively and drove luxury cars, service workers often treated him with exaggerated deference that felt uncomfortable and artificial. When he dressed casually and drove modest vehicles, he received more natural treatment that felt authentic, but sometimes bordered on indifference or mild disrespect. This contrast led him to an important insight. If he wanted to observe people's true character, he needed to remove the distorting influence of obvious wealth from the equation. People behaved differently around money, both those who had it and those who didn't, in ways that made authentic human connection nearly impossible. The solution was to present himself as someone ordinary, not poor, which might inspire either pity or contempt, but unremarkably middle class. Someone who worked for a living, worried about practical concerns, and didn't represent either an opportunity for advancement or a threat to anyone's status. In other words, someone who would be treated according to people's default mode of human interaction rather than their money-influenced behavior. The transformation required careful calibration. Alexander's clothing had to suggest financial stability without implying wealth. His vehicle needed to be reliable but unremarkable. His choice of restaurants and entertainment had to reflect middle-class sensibilities rather than luxury preferences. Most importantly, his conversation style and areas of knowledge had to remain consistent with someone who worked in business but wasn't extraordinarily successful. The results exceeded Alexander's expectations. Stripped of obvious wealth markers, he discovered a world of genuine human interaction that he'd forgotten existed. Restaurant servers treated him like a normal customer rather than someone whose tip might make their week. Retail workers helped him without calculating potential commission. Business contacts engaged with him based on the value of his ideas rather than his ability to write large checks. More significantly, Alexander began to identify people whose kindness and respect were unconditional. These individuals treated everyone, wealthy clients, middle-class customers, and service workers, with the same basic dignity and consideration. They didn't adjust their level of courtesy based on perceived status or potential benefit. They were simply good people who approached human interactions with authentic kindness. These discoveries became the foundation for Alexander's approach to business and personal relationships. When evaluating potential investments, he'd arrange to meet company executives in contexts where they wouldn't know his true identity or wealth level. He'd observe how they treated restaurant staff, hotel employees, and anyone else they encountered during their time together. Companies led by people who passed the WAITER test consistently outperformed those run by executives who showed character flaws in their treatment of perceived subordinates. The same principle applied to Alexander's personal life. When dating, he'd maintain his middle-class persona for at least several months before revealing his true circumstances. Women who were genuinely interested in him as a person remained interested regardless of his apparent financial status. Those who were primarily attracted to wealth usually lost interest when they believed he was just another working professional. This approach had protected Alexander from gold diggers and opportunists, but it also made genuine romantic relationships extremely rare. Most people, he'd learned, weren't entirely mercenary in their motivations, but they also weren't entirely pure. They were influenced by practical considerations like financial security and social status in ways that made it difficult to separate authentic affection from calculated interest. By the time Alexander reached his early 40s, he developed a sophisticated understanding of how wealth affected human behavior and had created an elaborate system for navigating those effects. His hidden-in-plain-sight approach allowed him to observe people's true character while protecting himself from those who might try to take advantage of his resources. But the system also created a profound loneliness. Alexander had wealth beyond most people's dreams, but he lacked the kind of authentic human connections that made life meaningful. His tests had become so refined that almost everyone failed it in one way or another. He'd become expert at identifying people's character flaws and ulterior motives, but had lost the ability to accept human imperfection as a natural part of relationships. This was Alexander's state of mind on that Thursday evening at Meridian Restaurant. He'd been conducting his usual experiment in social observation, watching Austin's elite perform their wealth and status, while remaining invisible among them. He'd seen dozens of people reveal their true character through their treatment of restaurant staff, and almost all of them had reinforced his cynical expectations about human nature. He had no reason to expect that this evening would be different from any other. No reason to think that a young woman in a borrowed dress would approach his table and provide an opportunity to discover whether genuine kindness still existed in a world increasingly defined by self-interest and calculation. But Zarachin was about to challenge every assumption Alexander had developed about human nature, wealth, and the possibility of authentic connection between people from different economic circumstances. Her mistake would create a test that neither of them expected, with consequences that would force both to reconsider everything they thought they knew about character, dignity, and the true meaning of wealth. The question that had driven Alexander's philosophy for 2 decades was about to receive an answer that would surprise them both. What happens when someone treats you with kindness not because they hope to gain something, but because treating others with dignity is simply who they are? Thursday, October 15th. The rain had been falling since noon, turning Austin streets into rivers of reflected neon and making the evening air thick with humidity that clung to everything like a wet blanket. By 8 p.m., the storm had intensified into the kind of downpour that sent pedestrians scrambling for cover and turned routine drives into exercises in patience and careful navigation. Zarachin stood outside Meridian Restaurant at 8:23 p.m., her borrowed black dress already damp from the brief walk from the bus stop. The umbrella she'd found in Kelsey's closet had broken 2 blocks away, leaving her to cover the remaining distance with nothing but a magazine held over her head. She looked at her reflection in the restaurant's rain-streaked windows and tried to salvage what remained of her carefully planned appearance. Inside, she could see exactly the scene she'd imagined during weeks of desperate planning. Successful professionals dining on meals that cost more than she made in a week, conducting business over wine that probably cost more than her monthly bus pass. The warm light and elegant atmosphere looked like something from a different world, a world she'd briefly inhabited 8 months earlier, but now could only observe from the outside. The contrast between her current circumstances and the prosperity visible through those windows was almost overwhelming. 3 months earlier, she might have been one of those diners, celebrating a successful project or entertaining clients on her company's expense account. Now she was standing in the rain with $12.37 in her wallet, preparing to approach strangers for money like some kind of sophisticated panhandler. The plan that had seemed marginally plausible during her desperate late-night planning sessions now felt absurd and humiliating. How exactly did one approach a wealthy stranger in an upscale restaurant? What words could possibly make such an intrusion seem reasonable rather than pathetic? How do you ask someone for money without destroying whatever dignity you have left? But the alternatives were even worse. Eviction notices don't pause for pride. Student loans don't forgive themselves out of sympathy. Her parents' retirement savings shouldn't be sacrificed because their daughter had trusted the wrong people and made poor decisions about employment and housing. Whatever happened tonight, it had to be better than admitting complete failure to the people who'd sacrificed everything to give her opportunities they'd never had. Inside Meridian, Alexander Kane sat at his usual table, number 17, positioned in a corner where he could observe the restaurant's main floor while remaining relatively inconspicuous. He'd been coming here twice a week for 3 years, not because he particularly loved the food, though it was excellent, but because he found the social dynamics endlessly fascinating. Meridian attracted exactly the kind of clientele Alexander had once been part of and now studied from a distance. Successful professionals, tech entrepreneurs, real estate developers, and old money families who treated expensive dining as a casual part of their weekly routine. It was a perfect laboratory for observing how wealth influenced human behavior, how status affected interpersonal dynamics, and how people's true character emerged in their treatment of those they perceived as subordinates. Tonight's crowd was typical for a Thursday evening. At table 4, 2 venture capitalists were discussing a potential investment in an artificial intelligence startup, their conversation peppered with the kind of technical jargon and financial projections that sounded impressive, but often masked fundamental uncertainty about emerging technologies. At table 9, a real estate developer was entertaining city council members, carefully navigating the line between legitimate business discussion and inappropriate influence peddling. Near the bar, a group of tech executives were celebrating someone's recent acquisition, their conversation growing louder and more self-congratulatory with each round of drinks. Alexander had observed similar scenes hundreds of times, successful people reinforcing their own importance through public displays of wealth and accomplishment. What interested Alexander most wasn't the obvious wealth on display, but the subtle interactions between the restaurant's clientele and staff. He'd watched the tech executives treat their server with casual indifference, ordering expensive items without looking up from their phones. He'd seen the city council members snap their fingers to get the bartender's attention, treating service workers like furniture that existed solely for their convenience. These weren't necessarily bad people, Alexander had learned. They were simply behaving according to social norms that they'd internalized about hierarchy, status, and appropriate relationships between different economic classes. Most of them probably considered themselves kind and respectful, and in their interactions with peers and superiors, they probably were. But Alexander's 20 years of observation had taught him that people's behavior toward those they perceived as having lower status revealed character traits that rarely emerged in other contexts. Someone who was rude to waiters might be charming in business meetings, but they were also more likely to be ruthless with employees, dishonest with partners, and generally untrustworthy when their own interests were at stake. At 8:35 p.m., Alexander noticed a hostess leading a young woman toward the bar area. The woman was clearly out of her element. Her dress was expensive but slightly damp. Her hair showed signs of recent rain exposure, and her body language suggested nervous uncertainty about being in such an upscale establishment. She looked like someone who'd once belonged in places like Meridian, but had fallen on hard times. Alexander had seen similar people before, formerly successful professionals who'd lost jobs, been through divorces, or experienced other financial setbacks that temporarily knocked them out of their usual economic bracket. They were often the most interesting subject for his observational studies because their recent proximity to wealth made them particularly sensitive to status dynamics and social hierarchies. The young woman took a seat at the bar and ordered what appeared to be the least expensive drink on the menu. She kept checking her phone and glancing toward the restaurant's entrance, maintaining the fiction that she was waiting for someone who might or might not appear. Alexander recognized the performance because he'd seen it many times. Someone tried to establish legitimate reasons for being in an expensive restaurant without the obvious means to afford it. What happened next would become seared into Alexander's memory with the kind of clarity that only accompanies truly unexpected moments. The young woman approached his table with a confidence that seemed at odds with her obvious nervousness. She held a plate of food that she clearly hadn't ordered for herself. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying the slight accent that suggested English wasn't her first language. "I think there's been a mistake. The gentleman at table 12 ordered the seafood special, and they sent over here instead. Could you please take this back to the kitchen?" She handed him a plate of lobster thermidor that cost $67 and represented more than she'd probably spent on food in the past week. Her assumption was clear and, from her perspective, entirely reasonable. A man sitting alone at an expensive restaurant, wearing work clothes and looking like someone who belonged to a construction site rather than among Austin's financial elite, must obviously be an employee rather than a customer. For Alexander, the moment crystallized 20 years of social observation into a single, perfect test case. Here was someone making exactly the kind of assumption about wealth and status that his hidden-in-plain-sight approach was designed to reveal. Someone who'd looked at his flannel shirt and work boots and concluded that he couldn't possibly be wealthy enough to dine at Meridian as a customer. But Alexander had also learned to recognize desperation when he saw it. This young woman wasn't being deliberately insulting or classist. She was clearly struggling financially, probably unemployed or underemployed, and had come to Meridian for reasons that had nothing to do with casual dining. Her mistake wasn't malicious. It was a result of someone whose recent experiences had trained her to make quick judgments about people's economic status based on superficial appearances. The question that would determine everything about what happened next was simple. How would she treat someone she believed was a waiter? Would she be kind and respectful? Or would she reveal the sort of character flaws that Alexander had observed in countless other people who felt superior to service workers? Alexander looked up at Zarachin and made a decision that would change both their lives. Instead of correcting her assumption or revealing his true identity, he chose to extend the test. He wanted to see how this desperate young woman would behave towards someone she believed was there to serve her. "Of course," he said quietly. "Right away." He took the plate and stood up, noting the relief that crossed her face as her awkward mistake was smoothly resolved. She clearly had no idea that the man she'd just mistaken for a waiter was worth more than some small countries, or that she'd inadvertently volunteered to participate in a test that had been 20 years in the development. As Alexander walked toward the kitchen, carrying a plate of lobster toward staff members who'd been serving him for 3 years, he had no way of knowing that he was about to discover something that would restore his faith in human nature. Something that would prove that genuine kindness and authentic character could still exist in a world increasingly defined by self-interest and calculation. The test had begun. Zarachin, broke and desperate, and completely unaware of what was happening, was about to reveal whether she possessed a kind of character that deserved a second chance from someone who'd been disappointed by humanity for 2 decades. But first, she had to survive the next hour without discovering that her mistake had been witnessed by someone who could either destroy what little remained of her dignity or offer her salvation in ways she couldn't possibly imagine. At 8:47 p.m., as Alexander Kane returned from his conversation with the kitchen staff, Zarachin was sitting at the bar trying to calculate whether she had enough money for a second drink. Her first, a club soda with lime that cost $4, had been consumed slowly over the past 20 minutes while she worked up the courage to identify and approach a potential target. The restaurant's clientele had thinned somewhat since her arrival, leaving fewer options for someone desperate enough to ask strangers for money. The venture capitalists at table 4 had moved to the bar, where their conversation about artificial intelligence investments had grown loud enough to be overheard by everyone in the vicinity. The real estate developer was still entertaining city council members, but their table seemed too crowded and political for her purposes. Alexander returned to table 17 and sat down, maintaining the fiction that he was a waiter who'd successfully resolved a minor mix-up. He'd spoken briefly with Roberto, the restaurant manager, explaining that he was conducting a social experiment and needed the staff to play along with whatever happened next. Roberto, who'd known Alexander for years and understood his unusual methods of evaluating people's character, had agreed without question. From Alexander's perspective, the test was now officially underway. Zara Chun had made her assumption about his identity and role, and he'd chosen to maintain that assumption rather than correct it. What happened next would reveal everything he needed to know about her character, her values, and whether she deserved the kind of help that someone in his position could provide. What Alexander couldn't have anticipated was how naturally Zara would slip into treating him like a human being rather than a service provider. When he returned to his table, she caught his eye and smiled. Not the perfunctory smile that customers usually gave to waitstaff, but a genuine expression of gratitude and connection. "Thank you so much for taking care of that," she said. "I was so embarrassed about the mix-up. I hope it didn't cause too much trouble in the kitchen." The comment revealed something important about Zara's character. She wasn't just grateful that her mistake had been resolved. She was concerned about the inconvenience it might have caused for him personally. In Alexander's experience, most customers who made similar mistakes were relieved to have them fixed, but rarely considered the extra work they might have created for restaurant staff. "No trouble at all," Alexander replied, studying her face for signs of the condescension or indifference he'd observed in countless other interactions between customers and service workers. Instead, he saw genuine concern and the kind of empathy that suggested she'd probably worked in service industries herself. "Are you sure?" Zara persisted. "I know how chaotic restaurant kitchens can be, and I'd hate to think I messed up someone's timing or got anyone in trouble with the chef." The level of consideration in her response was remarkable. Most customers, Alexander had observed, treated service issues as abstract problems to be solved rather than situations involving real people with real concerns. The fact that Zara was worried about how her mistake might affect kitchen staff suggested a perspective shaped by personal experience with service work and an understanding of how stressful such jobs could be. As the evening progressed, Alexander found himself in the unprecedented position of pretending to be his own waiter while observing how Zara Chin interacted with someone she believed was there to serve her. What he discovered challenged every cynical assumption he developed about human nature during his 20 years of hidden wealth. When Alexander approached her table to refill her water glass, Zara looked up from her phone and thanked him by name. She'd apparently asked Roberto what to call him during his brief absence. When he accidentally knocked over her silverware while reaching across the table, she immediately bent down to help him collect the pieces, insisting that accidents happened and that it wasn't a problem. Most remarkably, when another customer, a tech executive who'd been drinking steadily since 7 p.m., snapped at Alexander for being too slow with a drink order, Zara Chin actually intervened on his behalf. "Hey," she said to the angry businessman, her voice carrying a firmness that surprised Alexander. "He's doing his best. We're all just people trying to get through the day." The tech executive, clearly accustomed to being deferred rather than challenged, looked momentarily taken aback before grumbling something about standards of service and returning to his conversation. But Alexander had witnessed something extraordinary. Someone with no apparent power or status defending a stranger they believed was in an even more vulnerable position. This moment changed everything for Alexander. In 20 years of testing people's character through their treatment of service workers, he'd never seen someone defend someone they thought was a waiter from abuse by other customers. He'd seen polite indifference, casual kindness, and occasionally genuine respect, but never someone willing to confront another customer to protect a service worker's dignity. The interaction revealed something profound about Zara Chen's character. Despite her obvious financial struggles and desperate circumstances, she retained a fundamental belief in human equality and dignity that transcended economic status. She didn't see Alexander as just a waiter in the dismissive sense that many customers did. She saw him as a fellow human being deserving of basic respect and consideration. As the evening continued, Alexander began to understand that Zara's kindness wasn't performance or calculation. It was authentic character expressing itself naturally regardless of circumstances. When she asked about his schedule, She seemed genuinely interested in his answer, rather than just making polite conversation. When she complimented the restaurant's atmosphere, she specifically mentioned how professional and friendly the staff seemed, suggesting she'd been observing the service quality throughout the evening. Most telling was her behavior when Alexander made deliberate mistakes to test her reactions. When he brought her the wrong salad dressing, she smiled and said it was perfect anyway, clearly unwilling to create additional work or stress for someone she believed was already dealing with demanding customers. When he spilled a small amount of water while refilling her glass, she immediately moved her phone out of the way and helped clean up the spill without any trace of irritation. These weren't the actions of someone trying to impress a waiter in hopes of better service. They were the reflexive behaviors of someone whose default mode of human interaction was characterized by kindness, consideration, and respect for others regardless of their perceived status or ability to reciprocate. By 10 p.m., as Meridian prepared to close and the last customers were finishing their meals, Alexander had reached a conclusion that would have seemed impossible when the evening began. Zarachin was exactly the kind of person he'd been looking for during 20 years of testing human character. She possessed genuine kindness, authentic empathy, and a moral compass that remained steady even under extreme personal pressure. But Alexander also recognized that his test had created an unusual situation. Zara clearly had no money to pay for the meal she'd ordered, and she was obviously in some kind of serious financial distress. Her presence at Meridian wasn't casual dining. It was desperation dressed up as normalcy, probably part of some plan to approach wealthy customers for assistance. The ethical question facing Alexander was complex. He discovered someone whose character impressed him, but he'd also observed someone who was clearly planning to ask restaurant patrons for money. Her kindness toward him might be genuine, but her presence at Meridian was definitely calculated. Did her authentic character outweigh the deception involved in her being there under false pretenses? As Alexander considered how to handle the situation, he realized that Zara-chun had inadvertently provided him with something more valuable than another data point in his study of human nature. She restored his faith in the possibility of genuine human goodness. After years of observing people fail his test through callousness, indifference, or calculated kindness, he'd finally met someone whose character remained consistent regardless of circumstances. But there was still one more test to conduct. Alexander needed to reveal his true identity and observe how Zara reacted to knowledge that she'd been kind to someone who could actually help her rather than someone she believed couldn't do anything for her in return. Would her behavior change when she learned that her kindness had been observed by someone with the power to transform her circumstances? At 10:15 p.m., as the restaurant staff began their closing routine, Alexander Kane made a decision that would alter the trajectory of both their lives. He approached Zara's table one final time, but instead of maintaining his waiter persona, he sat down across from her and spoke the words that would shatter her assumptions about the evening. "I need to tell you something," he said quietly. "I'm not actually a waiter here." The color drained from Zara's face as the implications of his statement began to register. Her mind raced through the events of the past hour and a half, trying to reconcile what she believed with what she was now hearing. The man she'd mistaken for restaurant staff, the person she defended from an angry customer, the individual she'd treated with casual kindness and respect. He was apparently someone entirely different. "I'm so sorry," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I was thinking. I saw you sitting here, and I just assumed, with the way you're dressed." "Oh, God, did I get you in trouble? Did the staff think you were pretending to work here?" Her immediate concern was for him rather than her own embarrassment, which told Alexander something important about her priorities, even in moments of personal crisis. Most people, when confronted with such a mistake, would focus on minimizing their own humiliation rather than worrying about consequences for the other person involved. "My name is Alexander Kane," he continued, watching her face carefully for any sign of recognition. "I own Kane Capital Management. I've been coming to this restaurant for 3 years, and what happened tonight, what you did tonight, was extraordinary." Zara stared at him blankly. The name Kane Capital meant nothing to her. She'd been out of the business world for months, and investment management wasn't her area of expertise anyway. But the implications of what he was saying were becoming clear. She'd spent the evening treating someone who was apparently wealthy and successful like he was there to serve her. She'd made assumptions based on his appearance that were not only wrong, but potentially offensive. "I don't understand," she said finally. "If you're not a waiter, why did you pretend to be one? Why didn't you correct me when I handed you that plate?" Alexander leaned back in his chair, studying her face in the dim restaurant lighting. "Because I wanted to see how you'd treat someone you thought was a waiter. I wanted to observe your character when you believed you were interacting with someone who couldn't do anything for you professionally or socially." The explanation hit Zara like a physical blow. She'd been tested without knowing it, observed and evaluated like some kind of laboratory specimen. The kindness she'd shown hadn't been appreciated as genuine human decency. It had been analyzed as data in some wealthy man's experiment with human behavior. "You were testing me?" she asked, her voice carrying a mixture of hurt and anger. "You let me make a fool of myself because you want to see how I'd treat the help?" Alexander recognized the pain in her voice and realized that his explanation, while accurate, had made his behavior sound manipulative and cruel. "It wasn't like that," he said quickly. "Or rather, it started like that, but it became something entirely different. Zara. Can I call you Zara? What I observed tonight was the most genuine kindness I've seen in 20 years of watching how people treat service workers." "How do you know my name?" she asked, suspicion joining the hurt and anger in her voice. "You used your credit card at the bar," Alexander replied, then immediately realized how that sounded. "I wasn't spying on you. Roberto, the manager, mentioned it when I asked." The conversation was spiraling away from what Alexander had intended. He'd hoped to reveal his identity as a prelude to offering Zara help. But instead, he was appearing to be exactly the kind of manipulative, wealthy person that she probably expected all rich men to be. "Look," he said, trying to salvage the situation, "I know this sounds terrible. I know it seems like I was playing games with you for my own entertainment. But that's not what this was about. For the past 20 years, I've been disappointed by how people treat others when they think those others can't help them advance their careers or improve their circumstances. You were different. You were kind to someone you thought was a waiter, not because you hope to gain something, but because treating people with dignity is apparently just who you are." Zara stared at him, trying to process not just what he was saying, but what it meant about the evening she thought she'd just experienced. "So the whole time, while I was sitting here trying to work up the courage to ask you for help, you were secretly rich and secretly judging me?" The words hung in the air between them, revealing more than Zara had intended to share about her reasons for being at Meridian. Alexander realized that she'd inadvertently confirmed what he'd suspected, that she was in some kind of financial distress and had come to the restaurant hoping to find someone who might be willing to help her. "You came here to ask for help?" he said gently. Zara looked away, unable to meet his eyes. The humiliation of the evening was complete. Not only had she mistaken a wealthy customer for a waiter, but she revealed her desperate circumstances to exactly the kind of person she'd hoped to approach for assistance. Except now, instead of being a potential solution to her problems, he was someone who'd been secretly evaluating her character for reasons she didn't understand. "I lost my job 3 months ago," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "The company went bankrupt. I've been applying everywhere, but nobody will hire me because of the association with the scandal. I'm working at a coffee shop for minimum wage, and I can't make ends meet. My roommate expects me to cover her rent, and I don't have the money. I thought maybe if I came to a place like this, I might meet someone who—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. The plan that had seemed marginally reasonable in her desperation now sounded pathetic and manipulative when spoken aloud to someone who'd witnessed her evening firsthand. Alexander felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Genuine empathy for someone else's circumstances combined with admiration for their character under pressure. Here was a woman who'd lost everything through no fault of her own, who'd been reduced to asking strangers for money to avoid homelessness, and who'd still treated someone she thought was a waiter with more kindness and respect than most wealthy people show to anyone. "What's your background?" he asked. "Before the job you lost, what kind of work were you doing?" "Computer science," Zara replied, still unable to look at him directly. "I graduated from UT with a 3.8 GPA. I was working as a software analyst for a predictive analytics company called Novatech Solutions until the CEO turned out to be embezzling investor funds and the whole thing collapsed." Alexander knew about Novatech. The scandal had been covered extensively in the business press, and several investment firms had lost money on the company's fraudulent projections. But he also knew that the employees had been victims rather than conspirators, and that their association with the scandal was making them unemployable despite their skills and qualifications. "And you've been unable to find work in tech because of the association?" he asked. "Every company that looks at my resume sees Novatech and assumes I was part of the problem," Zara said. "Or they worry that hiring me will somehow taint their reputation. I've applied to over 200 positions in the past 3 months. I've had exactly 3 interviews, and none of them led to offers." Alexander sat quietly for a moment, considering what he'd learned about Zara Chin during their unexpected evening together. She was educated, experienced, and clearly skilled in her field. She'd been victimized by circumstances beyond her control. Most importantly, she possessed the kind of character and integrity that he'd been seeking in business associates for decades. But there was still one more test to conduct. Alexander needed to offer Zara help and observe how she responded to the knowledge that someone with the power to solve her problems had been watching her all evening. Would she be grateful and gracious, or would she become calculating and opportunistic once she understood what he could do for her? "I want to offer you something," Alexander said carefully. "But before I do, I need you to understand that what happened tonight, the way you treated me when you thought I was a waiter, the way you defended me from that drunk customer, the basic respect and kindness you showed, that's not something I see very often. That's not something I ever expected to see from someone who came to this restaurant hoping to ask wealthy strangers for money." Zara finally looked up at him, her eyes reflecting a mixture of hope and suspicion. "What are you offering?" "A job," Alexander replied. "A position at Kane Capital that matches your qualifications and pays what your skills are worth. But there will be conditions." The word conditions hung in the air between them like a warning. Zara had heard enough stories about wealthy men who helped young women in exchange for personal favors to be immediately suspicious of any offer that came with strings attached. "What kind of conditions?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. Alexander recognized the wariness in her tone and understood its source. "Nothing personal," he said quickly. "Nothing inappropriate. The conditions would be professional and ethical. I want to hire you because of what I observed about your character tonight, but I also want to make sure that your character remains consistent when your circumstances improve."